Officer Daniel Carter thought he had seen it all during his years patrolling the peaceful streets of Oak Ridge. But when a routine call leads him to a newborn black child abandoned in a cold, dark alley, his world is turned upside down. Determined to find the truth behind this shocking discovery, Daniel embarks on an investigation that pulls him deep into the shadows of the town he thought he knew. As he uncovers a tangled web of corruption, exploitation, and injustice, Daniel finds himself facing not only the darkest sides of Oak Ridge, but also the cracks in the very system he served his whole life. With powerful figures standing in his way, Daniel's pursuit of justice becomes more dangerous by the day, threatening his career and his life. Nothing can prepare him for the truth about the child's abandonment, a revelation so shocking it forces Daniel to confront his own biases and everything he thought he knew about his town. Officer Daniel Carter has spent years patrolling the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, upholding the law in a town that rarely sees more than minor disturbances. But when he stumbles upon a newborn black child abandoned in a cold alleyway, his world is shaken to the core. Determined to uncover the truth behind this heartbreaking discovery, Daniel embarks on an investigation that leads him deep into the shadows of the town he thought he knew. As he digs deeper, Daniel uncovers a dark network of corruption, exploitation, and racial injustice that has festered beneath the surface for far too long. The child's mother, a teenage girl, was forced into an impossible situation by powerful people who would stop at nothing to cover their tracks. The further Daniel goes, the more dangerous his pursuit of justice becomes, putting not only his career but his very life on the line. But nothing could prepare him for the shocking truth that will change everything he thought he knew about the case, about his town, and about himself. As secrets unravel and alliances shift, Daniel must confront his own biases and the dark realities of the system he serves. Officer Daniel Carter. Physical description: mid-40s, tall and muscular with salt and pepper hair, piercing blue eyes, and a rugged, weathered face from years on the force. His strong build and authoritative presence often command respect. Backstory: a seasoned officer in Oak Ridge, Daniel has always believed in law and order, but his career has been unremarkable until this case. Raised in a small, conservative town, his worldview has been shaped by a lifetime of enforcing the rules. However, the discovery of the abandoned child forces him to confront his own unconscious biases and challenge the system he serves. Tiana Jefferson. Physical description: a 17-year-old black girl with dark curly hair, deep brown eyes, and a petite frame. Her face often carries the weight of hardship, with tired eyes but a fierce determination. Backstory: Tiana grew up in poverty, raised by a single mother who struggled to make ends meet. Desperate and alone, she made a heart-wrenching decision to abandon her newborn child, believing she had no other option. As the investigation unfolds, her story reveals the systemic failures that led to her tragic choice, casting her as both victim and symbol of a larger societal problem. Captain Ray Donovan. Physical description: early 50s, broad-shouldered with graying hair and a strong jawline. He exudes authority and power, often dressed in impeccably pressed uniforms. His sharp eyes seem to catch every detail, but there's a coldness in them. Backstory: the head of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Donovan has been a key player in maintaining the town's status quo. Beneath his composed exterior, he harbors secrets that tie him to the corruption Daniel uncovers. His connection to the abandoned child case becomes a pivotal twist, exposing his hidden role in Tiana's plight. Margaret Maggie Carter. Physical description: late 30s, with auburn hair that falls in soft waves, warm brown eyes, and a slender frame. She has a gentle demeanor but a quiet strength beneath it. Backstory: Daniel's wife and the mother of their 2 children. Maggie is a former social worker who left the field after becoming disillusioned with the system. As Daniel becomes more involved in the case, Maggie's own experiences with broken systems and racial inequality surface, making her both a source of wisdom and emotional conflict for Daniel. Mayor Charles Harrington. Physical description: late 50s, tall and slim with silver hair neatly combed back, dark brown eyes, and a smooth, polished appearance. He dresses impeccably in tailored suits, projecting an image of power and control. Backstory: the influential mayor of Oak Ridge, Harrington is tied to the town's upper echelons of power and privilege. While publicly charismatic, he has been involved in maintaining systemic inequalities that benefit the elite. His connection to the darker elements of Oak Ridge's underbelly becomes central to Daniel's investigation, as secrets about his dealings with Tiana's family begin to surface. Oak Ridge Police Department, a modest, brick building at the heart of the town, symbolizing authority and control. Inside, it's a mix of worn desks, buzzing phones, and a steady stream of officers, all business as usual. The department is functional but outdated, reflecting the town's slow resistance to change. The interrogation room is cold and dimly lit, where Daniel confronts suspects and wrestles with his growing disillusionment. The alleyway, a narrow, dimly lit passage tucked behind a row of small businesses on the town's outskirts. Garbage bins line the walls, and the air smells of decay. It's here that Daniel finds the newborn baby, a place that mirrors the abandonment and neglect hidden within Oak Ridge. Tiana's home, a small, run-down apartment complex in the poorer section of town. The building is old, with peeling paint, broken windows, and flickering lights. Inside, Tiana's apartment is cramped but clean, a reflection of her mother's efforts to maintain dignity despite their struggles. The home is a constant reminder of the systemic poverty that traps families like hers. Mayor Harrington's mansion. In stark contrast to Tiana's home, the mayor's mansion sits on a sprawling estate just outside Oak Ridge. The grand house boasts immaculate lawns, towering gates, and a pristine white exterior. Inside, the mansion is filled with expensive furnishings, polished marble floors, and grand chandeliers. It's a symbol of the town's wealth disparity and the hidden corruption behind its polished facade. St. Agnes Church, an old, weathered church in the heart of Oak Ridge, with a faded stone exterior and a simple bell tower. Inside, the wooden pews and stained glass windows offer a place of refuge for the town's most vulnerable. The church becomes a crucial meeting point for Daniel as he seeks solace and guidance, and where key moments of revelation take place. Maggie, fearing for their safety, begs Daniel to let the case go, but he refuses, driven by a desire for justice. Daniel receives an anonymous tip about a meeting between the mayor and other powerful figures where they plan to cover up the baby's abandonment. Daniel conducts a stakeout of the meeting location, where he overhears incriminating conversations between Harrington and Donovan about their involvement in Tiana's disappearance. Determined to expose the corruption, Daniel initiates a raid on the property, but the operation goes wrong when Donovan intervenes, and Daniel is framed for misconduct. Daniel is suspended from duty, and the mayor publicly shames him, making it seem like Daniel's investigation was driven by personal vendettas rather than truth. Daniel, despite being suspended, continues to investigate and discovers that Captain Donovan has a personal connection to Tiana's case. He had been blackmailing her family for years. Maggie reveals that years ago, she had encountered Tiana's family through her work as a social worker, and they had been trapped in a cycle of poverty and exploitation perpetuated by the system. Daniel sneaks into the police department to retrieve a hidden file that contains the final piece of evidence linking Donovan and Harrington to the exploitation ring. Daniel confronts Donovan at his home, threatening to expose everything unless he comes clean. Donovan breaks down and admits his involvement, but it's too late. Harrington has already planned his escape. With enough evidence in hand, Daniel works with the journalist to expose the entire operation. Harrington is arrested, but Donovan flees, leaving his future uncertain. Tiana is found alive, but traumatized, living in hiding. She reunites with her baby, but the emotional scars remain. Though his career in the police force is over, Daniel finds solace in knowing he brought justice for Tiana and exposed the town's dark secrets. Maggie reflects on the case, encouraging Daniel to use his experience to advocate for systemic reform in Oak Ridge, starting with social services. Oak Ridge is shaken by the revelations, with the mayor's arrest causing waves throughout the community. People begin questioning the integrity of their leaders, sparking a slow movement for change. Daniel, now working as a private investigator, looks forward to the future with Maggie by his side, determined to continue fighting for justice in new ways. Oak Ridge's residents wrestle with the aftermath of the scandal, with many of the town's elite exposed for their roles in the exploitation. Some resist change, while others rally for reform. Tiana works to rebuild her life and care for her baby, but the trauma lingers. Daniel and Maggie support her as she navigates the system that once failed her. Daniel holds a press conference with the journalist, outlining the corruption and calling for accountability. His actions earn him respect, despite his career's abrupt end. Daniel and Maggie discuss starting a foundation to help marginalized families like Tiana's, determined to prevent future cases of abandonment and exploitation. As Oak Ridge begins to heal, Daniel looks out over the town, knowing his battle is far from over, but feeling hopeful for the first time in years. The legacy of the abandoned child will push the town, and Daniel, toward lasting change. Officer Daniel Carter sat in his patrol car, the familiar hum of the engine blending with the soft, steady rhythm of the night. The streets of Oak Ridge were quiet, as usual. A sleepy town, most people here were in bed by 10, leaving little for a cop to do beyond routine patrols. Daniel shifted in his seat, stretching his legs as he passed through the dimly lit residential streets. It was a night like any other, the kind where he could almost predict what was coming next, until he turned onto the darker, narrower roads leading toward the edge of town. Daniel glanced out at the rows of rundown houses, where paint chipped off weathered exteriors and a few lights flickered weakly in the windows. This part of town always felt different. There was a weight to it, a sense of forgotten lives living in the shadows of Oak Ridge's wealthier neighborhoods. His radio crackled, breaking the silence, but no calls came through. Just static. He was about to head back toward the main roads when something caught his attention. A faint cry. At first, he wasn't sure if it was real or if his mind was playing tricks on him. He slowed the patrol car, rolling down the window to listen more closely. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, piercing the night. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He pulled over, the soft crunch of gravel beneath the tires barely audible against the distant wail. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out of the car, scanning the alleyway just a few feet ahead. The cry grew louder as Daniel moved deeper into the narrow alley, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Trash bins lined the walls, their lids askew, with the faint stench of decay hanging in the cool night air. He stepped carefully, his boots echoing off the brick walls. And then, at the far end of the alley, he saw it, a small bundle on the ground, wrapped in what looked like a thin, dirty blanket. Daniel approached cautiously, his heart racing. The bundle moved, and another cry broke the silence. Kneeling down, he reached out and pulled back the corner of the blanket. His breath caught in his throat. A newborn baby, tiny and helpless, stared up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. The child's skin was dark, and the little body shivered in the cold. Daniel's hands shook as he lifted the baby into his arms, cradling the fragile life against his chest. Who would abandon a child like this? The question echoed in his mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I need immediate assistance at 5th and Oak Ridge. Found an abandoned infant." The words felt surreal as they left his mouth. He stared down at the baby, whose cries were now softer, almost as if the child had resigned itself to this cold, indifferent world. Daniel felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected, something between anger and sorrow. As he waited for backup and medical help, Daniel couldn't take his eyes off the child. A deep, unsettling feeling gnawed at him. There was more to this than just an act of desperation. The hospital lights were harsh, sterile, as Daniel watched the nurses tend to the baby. His patrol car had barely cooled down before the paramedics arrived, whisking the newborn away. Now, Daniel stood outside the small room where doctors and nurses swarmed, checking vitals, wrapping the baby in warm blankets. He lingered at the window, his thoughts a jumble of confusion and concern. A nurse passed by, and Daniel caught a snippet of her conversation. "It's always harder to find homes for them," she said softly to another nurse. "Especially black children. You know how it goes." Daniel felt a pang of discomfort. He had seen the inequalities in the system from a distance, but had never been confronted with them so directly. His mind raced, filled with questions. Where was the mother? What led to this tragic abandonment? He couldn't stand idly by. This wasn't just another case. The baby's wide, innocent eyes haunted him. He had to find answers. Back at the station the next morning, Daniel sat in front of his computer, scrolling through missing person reports. Captain Ray Donovan had brushed off the case when Daniel mentioned it, insisting they had other priorities, but Daniel couldn't let it go. Something about the situation gnawed at him. He focused on the reports, looking for anything that could give him a lead on the baby's mother. After an hour of fruitless searching, a report caught his eye. Tiana Jefferson, a 17-year-old black girl from the poorer side of town, had been reported missing 2 weeks ago. No one had seen or heard from her since, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were vague at best. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Tiana's description matched the profile of someone who might have been desperate enough to leave a baby in an alley. But it was just a hunch. Still, it was the only lead he had. Daniel pulled up to Tiana's apartment complex later that day, stepping out into a neighborhood that was far too familiar in its neglect. The building was old, its exterior peeling and weathered, with broken windows patched up with cardboard. Children played in the street, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim reality that surrounded them. He knocked on the door of the apartment listed in the report, half expecting no answer. But after a moment, the door creaked open, and an older woman stood before him, her eyes tired and suspicious. "Ms. Jefferson?" Daniel asked, glancing down at the name in his notebook. The woman nodded, folding her arms across her chest. "You looking for Tiana?" "I'm Officer Carter. I wanted to ask a few questions about her disappearance." Ms. Jefferson sighed, stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was small, cramped, but clean. Photos of Tiana hung on the wall, a young girl with a bright smile, her eyes full of life. But there was something in the older woman's face, a sadness, a resignation. "Tiana's been gone for weeks," Ms. Jefferson said, sitting down at the worn kitchen table. "I don't know where she went, but she was different before she left. Scared. I could see it in her eyes." Daniel's heart sank. He scribbled notes, asking more questions, but Ms. Jefferson had few answers. Tiana hadn't mentioned the baby, hadn't given any indication of what was happening. But Daniel was sure now, Tiana was the mother. Back at the station, Daniel stormed into Captain Donovan's office, slamming the door behind him. "We need to prioritize finding Tiana Jefferson," he said, voice firm. Donovan barely looked up from his desk. "We've got bigger cases to handle, Carter. A runaway teen and an abandoned baby aren't high on our list." "She's not just a runaway," Daniel argued. "Something happened to her. I think she was forced to abandon that child." Donovan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're overreaching, Carter. Let it go." But Daniel couldn't. He knew something darker was at play here, something no one else wanted to acknowledge. He was willing to risk his career if it meant finding out the truth. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Maggie, his wife, who listened as he recounted the case. Maggie had been a social worker before leaving the field, disillusioned by the endless stream of cases that never seemed to have a solution. She was quiet as Daniel spoke, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "You're right," she said softly when he finished. "The system is broken. Girls like Tiana, they're pushed into impossible situations. They fall through the cracks. But you need to be careful, Daniel. If you push too hard." Daniel knew what she was saying. This case was bigger than he realized, and the deeper he went, the more dangerous it would become. But he couldn't walk away now. He had to know why Tiana had been forced to abandon her child, and he had to stop whoever was behind it. As he sat back in his chair, staring out into the dark, he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back. Daniel returned to Tiana's neighborhood early the next morning, the sun casting long shadows over the worn-down apartment buildings. His mind buzzed with questions. He couldn't stop thinking about the abandoned baby, and he was sure now that Tiana Jefferson held the key to understanding why the child had been left behind. There was something about her disappearance that felt deliberate, too neat, too quiet. Walking up to the front door of her apartment complex, he braced himself for what felt like a shot in the dark. He knocked on doors, speaking with neighbors who gave him vague answers, people who seemed eager to distance themselves from Tiana's situation. "She kept to herself," one woman said, "but you could tell she had troubles." "Those kinds of troubles?" Another man, older with a scraggly beard, mentioned seeing Tiana just days before she vanished. "She looked scared," he muttered, glancing down the hallway, as if someone might be watching. real scared. That fear, Daniel knew, came from somewhere. It was more than just desperation, and it drove her to leave her newborn in an alley, a choice no mother would make lightly. As Daniel stood in the apartment's narrow hallway, the distant sounds of children playing outside faded into the background. He had a hunch that whatever was haunting Tiana wasn't over. He just needed to find her. Frustrated with the lack of concrete answers, Daniel returned to the apartment later that afternoon, this time with a plan. He convinced Tiana's mother to let him search the apartment, hoping for a clue, anything that might point him in the right direction. Inside, the place was neat but sparse. Tiana's room was small, decorated with faded posters of musicians on the walls and a pile of textbooks on the desk. As he sifted through her belongings, Daniel's eyes caught a piece of paper poking out from under the mattress. He reached for it, unfolding a worn, crumpled letter. The contents were brief, but it was enough to make his stomach tighten. "Meet me. Same place. No one can know about this." The letter wasn't signed, but the implications were clear. Tiana had been in contact with someone she didn't want anyone else to know about. Daniel's instincts told him this was bigger than a runaway girl. Later that evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, tapping the letter against the wood as Maggie cooked dinner. He explained the situation, laying out the pieces of the puzzle as best as he could. Maggie turned from the stove, her brow furrowed. "You're treading on dangerous ground," she said softly, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Girls like Tiana, they don't disappear without a reason. The system isn't set up to protect them. And if someone powerful is involved—" Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right. Maggie had seen this kind of thing before during her years as a social worker. Exploited, forgotten, and forced into impossible situations. But there was more to this. He could feel it. Someone wanted Tiana gone, and they wouldn't hesitate to cover their tracks. "I can't just walk away," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Not after finding that baby." Maggie crossed her arms, worry etched in her features. "Just be careful. Whoever she was meeting, they won't want to be found." The next morning, Daniel dug deeper into the town's public records, scanning for anything that might connect Tiana to someone influential. What he found startled him. The property records linked Mayor Harrington to a series of shady real estate transactions, one of which included an old building in the neighborhood where Tiana had lived. Harrington had always been an upstanding figure, or so Daniel thought. The mayor was a man of power, wealth, and charm. But something about his connection to Tiana's neighborhood, and that cryptic letter, felt wrong. Daniel's gut told him that Harrington was involved. And if the mayor was tied to Tiana's disappearance, things were about to get far more complicated. Determined to find out more, Daniel spent the day at the town's records office, combing through old files and contracts. There, buried in years of paperwork, he uncovered a financial paper trail that led directly to Mayor Harrington. Several businesses in town had been funneled through a series of shell companies, transactions that made no sense, except for the fact that they all circled back to Harrington. One name, in particular, stood out. The old property where Tiana was last seen had been purchased by one of Harrington's companies just a month before she vanished. Daniel stared at the document, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Tiana had been caught up in something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated, and Mayor Harrington was at the center of it. The evidence Daniel uncovered was enough to raise his suspicions, but he needed more. He couldn't confront Harrington without solid proof, and the more he dug, the more dangerous this investigation became. His search for the truth about Tiana and the abandoned baby had led him into a web of corruption, but this was only the beginning. As he prepared to confront the mayor, he realized that exposing the truth would come at a cost, and he wasn't sure how much he was willing to risk. Daniel stood at the gates of the old property on the outskirts of town, the one that had been purchased by Mayor Harrington's shell company. The place was dilapidated, overgrown with weeds, and clearly abandoned for some time. Yet something about the building called to him, a sense of wrongness, a hidden story waiting to be uncovered. He parked his car a few blocks away and approached the property on foot, his flashlight sweeping across the crumbling walls and shattered windows. The place was quiet, too quiet, as if the earth itself held its breath. Daniel's heart raced as he pushed open the rusted gate, which squealed in protest. He stepped into the courtyard, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The building loomed before him like a ghost from the past, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, a faint rustling, like someone watching from the shadows. Daniel whipped around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but he saw nothing. His breath came quicker now, and he knew he wasn't alone. Someone didn't want him here. The next day, Daniel found himself at the Oak Ridge Town Hall, standing in the grand marble lobby outside Mayor Harrington's office. He had spent the previous night tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that something sinister was happening on that property. He needed answers, and he was tired of waiting. He straightened his tie as the receptionist waved him inside. Mayor Charles Harrington was sitting behind his polished mahogany desk, his silver hair gleaming under the overhead lights. He looked up, flashing a politician's smile as Daniel entered. "Officer Carter," Harrington said smoothly, standing to greet him. "What brings you to my office today?" Daniel wasted no time with pleasantries. "I need to know about the property you purchased on the outskirts of town, the one where Tiana Jefferson was last seen." Harrington's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about, officer." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I've seen the records, Mayor. You own that property through a shell company. Tiana Jefferson disappeared there, and I believe you know more than you're letting on." Harrington's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. "I suggest you be very careful, Carter," Harrington said, his voice suddenly cold. "You're making dangerous accusations without any proof." Daniel stood his ground, his jaw clenched. "I'll get the proof." That evening, Daniel returned home, his head still buzzing with the confrontation. Maggie was sitting on the couch, reading a book, but she looked up the moment he walked through the door. She could see the tension in his face, the way his shoulders were tight with stress. "You're in deep, aren't you?" she asked softly, closing the book and setting it aside. Daniel sat down beside her, rubbing his hands over his face. "Harrington's involved. I'm sure of it, but I can't prove it yet." Maggie reached out and placed her hand on his. "You need to be careful, Daniel. Harrington's a powerful man. He's connected. If he's involved in something illegal, he won't let you expose him without a fight." Daniel nodded, knowing she was right. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, for Tiana, for the baby, and for himself. "I won't stop," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "I can't." The following day, Daniel met with a local journalist named Sarah, someone he trusted to help him dig into Harrington's shady dealings. Sarah was young but sharp, with a nose for corruption and a reputation for uncovering stories others wanted to keep hidden. They sat in a small cafe on the edge of town, papers spread across the table as they pored over the records Daniel had managed to collect. Sarah's eyes lit up as she connected the dots, her fingers flying over the keyboard of her laptop. "This is big," she murmured, glancing up at Daniel. "These financial transactions, Harrington's been funneling money through these shell companies for years, and they all tie back to that property." Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's the connection to Tiana?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know yet, but I think we're close. Give me some time to follow the money." Daniel nodded, feeling a surge of hope. He was finally getting somewhere. That night, back at the station, Daniel was reviewing the evidence when Captain Ray Donovan walked into the room. The air grew thick with tension as Donovan approached, his face a mask of disapproval. "You need to back off, Carter," Donovan said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any." Daniel stood, his muscles tensing. "This isn't trouble, Ray. This is corruption, and you know it." Donovan's eyes flashed with anger. "You're out of your depth. Harrington runs this town, and if you keep pushing, you're going to find yourself without a job or worse." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, but he refused to back down. "I'm not afraid of Harrington, and I'm not afraid of you." Donovan stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room. Daniel watched him go, his heart racing. He knew now that Donovan was involved. He just needed to figure out how deep his captain's ties went. Daniel's confrontation with Donovan solidified his resolve. The corruption ran deeper than he had imagined, and now both Harrington and Donovan were implicated. But with Sarah's help and the paper trail they had uncovered, Daniel knew he was closing in on the truth. The stakes were higher than ever, and he could feel the noose tightening around him. The next morning, Daniel sat in a booth at the diner, waiting for Sarah, the journalist he had met with the day before. His mind was racing, replaying the tense exchange he had with Captain Donovan the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that his captain was more deeply involved than he'd initially thought. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Sarah walked in, her laptop slung over her shoulder and a stack of papers in her arms. She slid into the booth across from Daniel, her eyes sharp with focus. "I found something," she said without preamble, pulling out the papers. "The financial records you uncovered, there's more to them. Harrington's been involved in these shady deals for years, but there's a pattern. Every time a new shell company is formed, a vulnerable family in town is affected." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, affected?" Sarah flipped open her laptop and turned it toward him. "Families that are already struggling financially, single mothers, minorities, people without much of a safety net. Every time a shell company buys property, those families are forced out. And guess what? Tiana's family was next on the list." Daniel's heart sank. "So, Harrington was targeting them?" Sarah nodded grimly. "And Tiana? She probably found out. Maybe even tried to fight back." That afternoon, Daniel received an anonymous tip through the station's email system. The message was short, but it was enough to make his pulse quicken. "If you want to know the truth about Tiana, meet me at the Old Docks at 8 p.m. Come alone." Against his better judgment, Daniel decided to follow the lead. He couldn't afford to let this case go cold, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel drove to the docks, parking his car in the shadows where it wouldn't be easily spotted. He stepped out of the vehicle, his hand resting on the gun at his hip as he scanned the area. The docks were deserted, the only sound the faint lapping of water against the pier. A figure emerged from behind a stack of crates, a man in his late 30s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "You Daniel Carter?" the man asked, his voice low. Daniel nodded. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I used to work for Harrington. I'm the one who handled the paperwork for his deals. I know what's been going on." Daniel's heart raced. "Tell me everything." The man sighed. "Harrington's been running this racket for years, blackmailing families, exploiting people. Tiana found out because her mom was next on his list. When she tried to go public, Harrington threatened her. I don't know all the details, but I do know she was desperate." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Tiana hadn't simply run away. She had been running for her life. The next day, Daniel met with Sarah again, armed with the information he'd gathered from his mysterious informant. They spent hours cross-referencing files, putting together the pieces of a conspiracy that stretched deeper than Daniel had anticipated. Sarah pulled up an old legal document on her laptop, her eyes scanning the page before she turned the screen toward Daniel. "This is it. This is the agreement Harrington made with the other business leaders in town." The car sped off, leaving Daniel trapped in the back, his mind racing. He had been caught. The men didn't say a word as they drove, their faces hidden in the shadows. Daniel's stomach twisted with dread. He had gotten too close, and now they were going to silence him for good. The SUV pulled up to a remote location just outside of town, an old, abandoned lot surrounded by trees. The men dragged Daniel out of the car, forcing him to his knees in the dirt. Captain Donovan stepped out of the shadows, his face cold and expressionless. "You should have listened, Carter," Donovan said, shaking his head. "You had a good career, a good life, but you couldn't leave well enough alone." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "You're in on this, Donovan. All of it. Tiana, the baby. How could you do this?" Donovan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Daniel thought he saw a flicker of regret in his captain's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Sometimes, you do what you have to do," Donovan said quietly. "Now, you're going to take the fall for this. You're going to be the one responsible for all of it. The corruption, The blackmail. It's all on you now. Before Daniel could respond, one of the men pulled out a gun, pressing it against his back. He froze, his mind spinning. They were framing him, setting him up to take the blame for everything they had done. But just as he thought it was over, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Donovan's face twisted in frustration. "Let's go," he barked at the men, and they scrambled back to the SUV, speeding off into the night. Daniel collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with adrenaline. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, a squad car pulled up beside him. The officer inside rushed over, helping Daniel to his feet. "They tried to frame me," Daniel gasped, still reeling from the near-death encounter. "But we have to get them. We have to stop them." As Daniel stood under the flashing lights, his mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. He had narrowly escaped with his life, but the conspiracy was far from over. Now, more determined than ever, Daniel knew that he had to take down Donovan and Harrington, no matter the cost.